Okay, hello FINDA. I'm David Bender. Oh God, this table is shaky. Okay, well, I'm a shakier version of David Bender than normally exists. I'm a PhD student at the University of Hull, which is a university in the United Kingdom. We have what's called the Centre for Legislative Studies here. We're kind of a centre for the study of formal political institutions within parliamentary democracies, particularly Western parliamentary democracies, and that's not quite, but to a large extent, what my PhD specialises in. So today I'm going to be talking about formal political institutions. I'd just like to thank all of you for coming to listen. It's really nice to be able to talk about debating, and to be able to talk about something I care about in debating, which is, you know, because I'm really sad and nerdy, formal political institutions, and actually have people listen to that and be interested in that. So thanks for coming. What we've got is a PowerPoint presentation, which means you won't have to look at my shaky face on the shaky laptop on the shaky table for much longer. Unfortunately, we've had some technical problems, which means we can't have my face in the PowerPoint presentation at the same time. So I'm going to disappear. I might come back for a bit if there's an extended period of time I need to talk to. The PowerPoint presentation I will share with FINDA. I've actually shared it with the FINDA Google Drive account already. So I think Angelos will be able to share that with you. It's got quite a lot of slides, but it's more or less just an animation of things. So I wouldn't worry too much about the enormous number of slides. So I'll get the screen share set up now so you're able to see the presentation. That means me and my very lovely living room are going to disappear from your, from your view. Don't worry, I'll be back later. I'll see you in a bit. And you should still be able to hear me. If you can't hear what I'm saying after this, panic and tell Mila or Angelos, and we'll sort that. Okay, so goodbye face, but you'll still be able to hear my voice. Okay, so hopefully all of you can see this PowerPoint presentation and you can still hear me. As I say, panic quickly if you can't hear me. Oh, you can't hear me say that. That's not helpful. Oh well, I'm sure that got a laugh. So, today's talk is about formal political institutions. To begin with, very quickly, I'm just going to outline what we're talking about in this talk. And then we're going to go through three main sections. The first of which is what to do if you're not really familiar with a particular democracy, and ways that you can bluff, just talk your way up, pretend that you know what you're talking about if you don't know about a particular democracy that comes up. Then we're going to talk about concepts of democracy and what are the ideas that are going to be at stake within these debates. Those aren't going to be all of the ideas. There'll be other ideas that will come up within these debates, depending on what sort of a debate it is. So if it's a debate about women's representation in political institutions, you'll have all of the democracy concepts, but you'll also have all of the feminism concepts as well. So don't think this is everything that will come up in the debate, but it will be some of the concepts that will come up in the debate. And then we're going to talk about words for different types of participation and what they mean. Okay, sorry about the dings, by the way. I'll just see if I can mute that. One sec. Oh, I've got a message. The presentation is a bit small. Can I make it bigger? Unfortunately, I can't because of the... Oh, maybe I can. One sec. Is that helpful? That's a bit bigger now. Excellent. Sorry about that. I hope everyone can see it now. It's gone a bit blurrier. Okay, awesome. So, formal political institutions. This is what we're talking about. So, I just want to get very technical with definitions for the moment, but I promise that this is going to get more interesting in a bit and we'll get a lot more practical. So, a formal political institution is just an organisation, a political organisation. Now, I say the word organisation because that often implies that there are lots of people within an organisation. An organisation in this way isn't necessarily more than one person, but it's organised in a particular way. So The office of the Prime Minister is a political organisation, because even though there's just one person who's the Prime Minister, it's organised, it's a formal thing. And the purpose of a political institution specifically is to enact, perform or enable politics. Any of those three will do. And it's formal when it's permanent, enduring and enabled by the state. So that was a bit boring. This is just to clarify the list of things we're not talking about. So we're not talking about organisations that pop up and disappear like pressure groups. I'm not going to get too detailed on the way that individual politicians behave or international organisations. It's also, I'm not going to talk extensively about ideologies. I've just had a note, I'm a bit too loud. I'll try to get that quieter. And best thing to do, I'll just go further away from the microphone. Okay, so political ideologies are not political institutions, they're things that political institutions do. I'm also not talking about social movements like feminism, again that's transient, and there are things that teach people about politics like universities and schools. They're not political institutions because they're just to educate people. Their job isn't to do politics, their job is to teach people about politics. Okay, so that's what we're talking about today. We're talking about formal political institutions. So, I'm going to introduce something called the basic structure of democratic politics. And the point of this is, if you don't know what a democracy looks like or the way that a particular democracy is structured, then this basic structure of democracy is probably how it's structured. So, let's look at the organisations, the institutions. So you've got the people, who are the citizens of the country. Oh, yeah, okay. And then there's the Parliament, which is all of the members of Parliament together when they vote on things. You've got the President or Monarch. I think in Finland it's a President. You've got the government, the Supreme Court, and the enforcement agencies of the government. So the police or the finance ministry or the Ministry of Employment or whatever offices, organisations, people actually enforce laws that the government makes. So how does this structure work? So the first thing that happens is that the people elect the Parliament. They choose who they want to represent them and put them into Parliament. Then what happens is the Parliament elects the government, which is appointed by the President or Monarch. The government then appoints the Supreme Court and employs the people who enforce the laws within the country. So when we talk about, the police, they're an enforcement agency and they're employed by the Interior Ministry, which is part of the government. So that's the basic structure of how things are, what the lines of accountability are within a democracy. And as you can see, ultimately, everything seems to come back down to the people. So even though the people don't pick the government enforcement agencies, they elect the Parliament that elects the government that employs the government enforcement agencies. So that's the way that ultimately, even in a democracy where you've got people who seem to be having power over you, like the police, that's how it comes back to the idea that the people are ultimately in charge. So there's one person on this diagram which doesn't seem to be related to the people, which is the President or Monarch. So how does it work in the case of a monarch? Well, the first thing we need to do is squish this diagram down a bit, and we need to add an extra person, which is, in a monarchical system, God, whose official job it is to decide who the monarch is. But don't worry about that, because really what happens is the Parliament just checks what God decided to do and confirms that that's who the monarch's going to be. If you've got a president, like in Finland, what will happen is either Parliament elects the president or the people elect the president. So even in the cases where you've got a president or monarch who doesn't seem to be chosen by the people, what happens is they're either elected by Parliament, in which case Parliament is elected by the people, or they're just elected directly by the people, or it's a monarch, in which case you've got Parliament, which is elected by the people, that just makes sure that the divine will of our Creator is correctly identified. The other thing to remember about president or monarch is they're not very important in our political system. We wouldn't worry too much about them and the way that they work. So that's the system. Those are the lines of accountability. How does this work if we want to make rules within our democracy? Lawmaking in the basic structure of democracies. So the first thing that will happen is the government will draft a new law. So the government will get all of their civil servants together and they'll come up with an idea for a new law. Maybe they want to, I don't know, change what colour the police uniform is. And they'll write the new law and they'll send this off to Parliament. And Parliament will then debate, amend, and probably pass the law. Now, Parliament doesn't have to pass the law, but it's worth remembering that Parliament picked who the government was, and they probably wouldn't pick a government that wasn't going to write laws that they liked. So usually, Parliament will pass the laws the government wants. That doesn't mean that Parliament is powerless, because remember, Parliament chose who the government was, but it does mean that Parliament usually passes the laws. Sometimes they amend or change the laws a bit. They'll often have a debate about it. And then they send it off to the president or monarch, whose job it is then to sign it. And remember what we said earlier, they're unimportant. So they know that if they didn't sign it, they'd be fired and someone new would be gotten in. So they almost always sign it. And then they send it off to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will check that it's all constitutional and that it doesn't break any of our fundamental rights. And then they'll send it to the government enforcement agencies, who ultimately enforce the law on the people. So that's how that system works. So let's, because this is all a bit abstract, let's look at how this actually works in reality. So here's how it works in Finland. And I'm really, really sorry if I don't pronounce these things correctly, but what happens is that Finnish citizens elect the eduskunta, who then elect who the cabinet is, so the Sipla cabinet is the current government, and then they appoint the Supreme Court and they employ, for instance, the police in this case, and you've got the president over here who is elected by the people. And then if you want to make a law, the cabinet will write the law, they'll draft the law, and they'll send it to the eduskunta, who will debate, amend, and pass the law, send it to the president, who will sign it, they'll send it to the Supreme Court, who'll check it's constitutional, and then they'll give it to the police, whose job it is to enforce the law. And it doesn't have to be the police, it could be the, I think that's the Environment Ministry or the Employment Ministry, and it could be the Finance Ministry who enforces it. It doesn't matter who enforces it, the point is, whoever enforces it, ultimately those decisions are decisions that have been made by Finnish citizens. So here are some more examples of how this works in reality. So in Estonia, Estonian citizens elect the Riigikogu. The Riigikogu then picks who the government is, and then governments draft laws, send them off to the Riigikogu, who then send them off to the president to sign them, send them to the Supreme Court, and then send them to enforcement agencies. Here's how it works in Israel. Israeli citizens elect Knesset. They pick the government, and then government writes laws, sends it to Knesset, sends it to the president, sends it to the Supreme Court, who send it to enforcement agency. One more example, here's how it works in Sweden. It's the same basic system, it works the same more or less in all other places, and we'll get to some ways in which it works a bit differently in other cases, but it's the same basic structure everywhere. So there are some other structures of democracy, some ways it works differently in different countries. So by the way, I hope I'm not talking too fast. If I am talking too fast, like post on the Facebook thread where the link was posted, and I can speed up or slow down depending on what you say. So the first way that it's sometimes a bit different is when you have what's called a bicameral system, and that's where you have two houses of parliament. So how does that work? So instead of just having a parliament like this, what we have is we have what's called an upper house of parliament and a lower house of parliament. And how are all of these houses chosen? Well, usually what happens is the people elect the lower house of parliament, and then the lower house of parliament will pick who the government is, which is appointed by the president or monarch. And then what happens is either the lower house of parliament appoints the upper house, or the government appoints the upper house, not all at the same time. They'll be appointed over different years. And obviously, as normal, the government appoints the Supreme Court and employs the people to enforce its laws. And then when lawmaking happens, what happens is the government drafts the law, sends it to the lower house of parliament. The lower house will debate, amend, and pass it, send it to the upper house of parliament. The upper house usually only has the right to debate and amend it, and they send it back to the lower house, who will agree a final version with the upper house, and the upper house will then agree to that final version, send it to the president, who then signs it, sends it to the Supreme Court, and then they confirm it's constitutional, and then government enforcement agencies enforce it. So here's an example of one system that's a bicameral system. That means there's two houses, bi meaning two, cameral means houses, basically. So Canada has a House of Commons, which is elected by the people, and they have a Senate, which is appointed by the government. And the Senate can decide to block laws, but it very rarely blocks them. It's very unusual. It's a big controversy in Canada if the Senate decides to block a law. In Germany, you've got the Bundestag, which is elected by the people, and the Bundesrat, which is picked by regional government. And again, the Bundesrat can block laws, but very rarely decides to block them. It normally just amends the laws. Sometimes if there's a regional government that has a particular objection to a way that a law works, they'll amend the law to account for their objection. And then there's my country, the United Kingdom. We've got the House of Commons, which is elected by the people, and then we have the House of Lords, which is 15% just made up of aristocrats, which lots of people think is ridiculous. But 80% of it's picked by the Parliament and government. And we also have 5% of the members are senior bishops. In Britain, we've got the Church of England, which is a government-run church. It's bishops from the Church of England. And they can delay and amend laws, but they cannot block laws. Now, in a couple of cases, the upper house is elected, it's not appointed. This is more unusual. Usually the upper house is appointed. In Australia, both House of Representatives and the Senate is elected by the people, but the important difference is the Senate doesn't elect the government. One very unusual case is Italy, where you've got the Camera dei Deputati, which just means Chamber of Deputies, and the Senato, which means the Senate, which has all of the former prime ministers are in there. And what's very unusual in this case is the Senate can elect who the government is. And Italy's really unusual for having this. In most places, it's only the lower house, so the Camera dei Deputati, that's allowed to pick the government. Now, some things to say about upper houses. They're usually more conservative than the lower house. They're usually less in favour of radical change. And the reason for that is they usually represent more rural interests. There are historical reasons for that in every country, but because they tend to represent rural interests, they tend to be a bit more conservative. In bigger countries, you're more likely to have a bicameral system, and that's either geographical, so Canada doesn't have many people in it, but it's like this enormous country. I think it's the third largest country in the world, and they have two chambers. In a country like Germany, which isn't, by international standards, I suppose Germany's quite big. Well, Germany's quite big geographically, but it's also got a very high population, and that's a bicameral system. One more structure of democracy I want to look at, one more change to the basic structure of democracy, and that's a system called presidentialism. Now, this is also an unusual system, like bicameralism. Most countries aren't presidential systems, but we'll see how that works. So, this is the structure, same structure as before. You'll notice one difference, though, which is that it's Congress instead of Parliament, and that's just, they do the same thing. Congress is like a Parliament, but it's called a Congress in the presidential system. Don't ask me why. And the difference is, the main difference is, instead of being unimportant, the president is very important and gets a halo around him or her. So in a presidential system, the people elect Congress, but they also always elect the president. And the president appoints the government, and the government employs its enforcement agencies. The president also appoints the Supreme Court, not the government. Normally the government would appoint the Supreme Court. In this case, the president appoints them. Now, there's a bit of a star by this, because appointments are a bit more complicated than I mentioned here. So we'll go through how appointments work in a presidential system. So what will happen is the president will nominate a candidate for a position that they're appointing someone to. So they might appoint Matt Damon to be ambassador to Finland. And then Congress usually will agree to that, and that Matt Damon is now the ambassador to Finland, and Matt Damon's part of the government. but sometimes it doesn't quite work like that. So Congress disagrees. They really want a programmer to be the ambassador to Finland, and then the president will respond, well, I was elected by all the Americans and you weren't, you were just elected by the people in your state. And then Congress goes, oh, yeah, all right, fine, I agree then, and appoints Matt Damon to the government. Sometimes, and this is even rarer than the alternative, what will happen is Congress really, really disagrees. They're really not having Matt Damon. And the president will make a small concession. They'll say, okay, we won't have Matt Damon, but we'll have a different actor instead. They'll have Pamela Anderson, and then Congress agrees and appoints Pamela Anderson to be the ambassador to Finland. Now, obviously, that's a funny example, but that's how it works in practice. If the president isn't given what they want, they'll just keep nominating people who are similar until they do get what they want. So the president usually gets her way. Not always, but the president usually gets her way because Congress knows they have the lower hand in this negotiation. So how are laws made in the presidential system? So unlike in the normal system, what happens is that lots of people can draft laws. So sometimes the government drafts the law, sometimes the president drafts the law, and sometimes Congress drafts laws for itself. It doesn't have an outside body do it, but they write the law to begin with. Congress will then debate, amend, and pass the law and send them to the president. Now, the president will sometimes choose to sign the law, but sometimes, and because the president is elected, it's more okay for them to do this. They'll sometimes veto the law and say, no, I'm not having that law, we want a different law. And if they decide to sign it, then it goes to the Supreme Court. If they don't sign it, the law's dead, there's no law for anyone. So the president will sign the law, it goes to the Supreme Court says whether or not it's constitutional, and then government enforcement agencies enforce the law. So there's also a system called semi-presidential systems. In this system, Parliament appoints some of the government, and the president deals with defence and national security directly. American countries tend to be presidential. French and Francophone countries, so that's countries that used to be in the French Empire, tend to be semi-presidential. What that means is most countries aren't presidential. So let's have a look at the different types of systems we've gone through. So we talked about bicameral systems. The normal system is unicameral. Uni means one, cameral means house. So what happens in the unicameral system is one election decides the whole parliament, and that's done by the population as a whole. And that means there's one group of people, which is all of the citizens, who are deciding who are in parliament. It tends to be easier to pass laws in a unicameral system because you've only got to get one group of people to agree to it. In a bicameral system, you've got two different elections for different bits of parliament. Sometimes they're by different people, so it could be regional governments, it could be aristocrats, could be bishops decide who are in the parliament. It means you can have two different types of representation within your political system. So you can represent regional concerns and citizens' concerns in the same system. It's generally a bit harder to pass laws because you've got to get two different groups of people to agree. So the normal system, parliamentary system, that's what we looked at the beginning. One election decides government and the parliament at the same time. And for that reason, because it's a single election, it's called a fusion of powers, fusion, things put together. But it's a bit deceiving because actually governing power is split between parliament and government because parliament picks who the government is going to be. So even though it's called a fusion of powers, some people argue that power is actually more separated in that system, which is confusing. And the president might exist, it might be a monarch, but they're an unimportant person. And in the presidential system, you elect the government and the legislature. So the legislature is the parliament or Congress, and you elect them in separate elections. They might be held on the same day, but people could vote for one party. They could vote for the centre party for the congressional election, and they could vote for true Finns to be the president. And it's called the separation of power because you've separated the governing and law-making powers. They're separate from each other. They're not fused like in a parliamentary system. And the president is an important national figure in a presidential system. Okay. The next thing I just want to talk about very briefly, and this is like super generic advice, but it does apply to political systems in BP. So it's nouns and BP debating. So it's good to have lots of examples in BP, and I think once you've seen this, it's now, I hope, fairly obvious that most systems are basically the same. Sometimes it's presidential or parliamentary, sometimes it's bicameral or unicameral, but they all follow the same basic system. It's quite easy to switch around lots of different examples with the same analysis. So having lots of examples obviously improves your case. It's also a really sneaky way of having an extension when you have no extension. So if you're at the European University's Debating Championship and there's two British teams in the top half of the debate, you can have an extension by saying you're applying the logic of the debate to parliamentary systems in Europe, and you can say the same thing as them, but it might sound really new because you brought in new examples. You can say your examples are more important because they only talked about Britain, whereas you can talk about all of the parliamentary systems of Europe. So it's worth learning the names of a few different countries' political systems, but also don't overload yourself, because obviously most motions aren't about politics or don't even touch on politics, but it's worth learning a couple. So what you want to know if you're learning about a system, you don't need to know loads, you just need to know the name of the parliament, what are the names of the major parties, and who is the Prime Minister. And there are two types of countries I think you want to know about. There's countries that come up a lot in BP debating because either there's a lot of debaters from that country or because there's a lot of politics that goes on there, and there's some extra countries that just make you look clever because you know about lots of examples. So the countries that come up a lot tend to be Israel, which is important because of the Israel conflict that's going on in that region, Germany, which is very important within European politics, United States of America, obviously important in international politics, and the United Kingdom, there are obviously lots of debaters that come from the United Kingdom. That means, unfortunately, that country tends to come up more often than it probably should. I'd also recommend, if you're going to a tournament somewhere, particularly an important tournament, learn about that country. And so there's Poland EUDC, and I think it might be worth learning about Poland for that reason. If you want some extra examples, bigger isn't necessarily better. You don't need big countries. Like, smaller countries can make you sound even more well-informed about the world. So Finnish examples are fine, but just make sure you're clear to the judges what those examples mean. So if you want to talk about the parliament in Finland, make sure you're clear. It's like Congress if you're talking to an American judge, or what the type of party is from, about the Finns party, that's the right-wing party like UKIP. I picked some diverse examples here: New Zealand, Spain and Finland. Those are the ones I've done research for you for. They'll be available on the PowerPoint presentation after this talk. You could pick your own, but I've worked through the examples for those ones. Cool, so let's have a chat about parties within national systems, because as we saw in the first section, there's a lot of similarity between different types of political system, and there's also a lot of similarity between different types of parties. What that means is you probably know a lot more about every country's political system than you realise, because you know about the parties in Finland. There's a question here. Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay, so I've just had a point about the constitutionality of laws. So it was actually done by a law committee in Finland, not the Supreme Court. So I'm sorry I got that wrong. That's unusual. Most countries, there's a separate court that decides who if laws are constitutional rather than checking inside the parliament. But that's really useful to know. Thanks for posting that. Oh, and sorry, someone's asked me to speak slower. I spoke quite quick. Fair enough. Okay, sorry about talking too quickly. So, parties in national systems. There are different types of parties that exist in all sorts of different parliamentary systems. And while every national party is different, and there'll be odd things about each different type of party, there's more similarity than you think. And that means that you probably know quite a lot about how British political parties work, even if you don't know anything about them specifically, because you do know about Finnish political parties or political parties in other countries. So it might be important for national context, but it's not that important. So we'll go through some broad types of parties and link them back to the Finnish political system. So the first one are social democrats. They like things like the welfare state, they like things like higher taxes, they tend to be very supportive of workers' rights, and they tend to be against really radical left-wing politics or neoliberalism, which is, deregulation, less workers' rights, higher growth, and so on. They tend to be supported by trade union organisations. Oh, I've been told I've got some echo. Right. Okay. Cool. Hopefully that sorted out any echo if that was on my end. So usually the Social Democrats are one of the two biggest parties within a political system, and they're usually coloured red. Historically, they'll have been a socialist or radical party, and they're sometimes called the Socialist Party or the Labour Party or the Social Democratic Party. So in Finland, you've got the Social Democratic Party, the SDP, and that's very similar to the German Social Democratic Party, SPD, New Zealand Labour Party, the Socialist Workers' Party of Spain, PSOE, Partido Socialista Obrero Español, which is why the acronym is different, and the United Kingdom Labour Party. So things are a bit different in Israel. They've got the Labour Party. The Labour Party teamed up with another party to form the Zionist Union Party. And in the United States of America, you've got the Democratic Party, which is not really a social democratic party, but it's similar in the way it works to the Finnish Social Democratic Party. So there's some similarities there. You don't need to worry too much about the national context. Okay, the next group are business liberal parties. So they like free markets, deregulation, getting rid of what they'd see as unnecessary rules, lots of economic growth, and they tend to be slightly sort of patriotic in nature. They're sort of more patriotic, I think, than the Social Democrats would be in terms of the way that they symbolise themselves, even if you might disagree with which party is best for the country. And they are generally against restrictions on business, which they think reduce economic growth, and trade unions. And they tend to be supported by businesses, which is why they're called business liberals. And they're also usually one of the two biggest parties, and they're usually coloured blue. Now, historically, they weren't actually business parties. They used to either be conservative parties, which were supported by the aristocrats, the landowners of the country, or they tended to be Christian democratic parties, which are church-based parties. So they're often called by their historical name. So they're sometimes called the Christian Democratic Party or the Conservative Party. And some other places they're called the National Party or Popular Party, depending on how they were formed. So their names are usually very historical, even though they don't reflect what they believe in now. So in Finland, the National Coalition Party is the closest party to this. Germany has the Christian Democratic Union. Israel's a bit harder to clarify in this case. So Yesh Atid was set up explicitly as a business liberal party, but lots of businesses support Likud, and we'll go into a bit about why Israel's a bit different in this regard later. New Zealand has the National Party, Spain has the Partido Popular, the Popular Party. Popular Party doesn't mean like literally it's very popular, it's got lots of support. It means it's populist, even though it's a business liberal party, which I think some people would argue isn't the most populist thing. Poland has Civic Platform. The US of A has the Republican Party, which is usually seen as the business liberal party, and the United Kingdom has the Conservative Party. Okay, right-wing populists. These have become a lot bigger in recent years. So they tend to like immigration restrictions. They actually tend to like, even though they're called right-wing, and this isn't usually associated with the right-wing, they tend to be very supportive of the welfare state. So things like unemployment benefit, things like health service, but they also tend to be very economically nationalist, unlike business liberals. They support less trading with other countries and usually more sort of internal industrial growth. And they tend to dislike immigrants, and in European countries, or even not in European countries, they don't like the European Union. And they're mainly supported by populist movements. They don't have, like, social democrats have organisations like trade unions, and business liberals have businesses to support them. Right-wing populists tend to be supported by just individuals who care a lot about that political system. Size varies, but they're increasing rapidly. There isn't a sort of single colour that tends to signify them. It's often a national colour, and they're usually very new parties, although in a couple of places they're old fascist parties that have been reformed. So that's true in Austria, I think. So in Finland, there's the Finns party. In Germany, Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, which is Alternative for Germany. New Zealand has New Zealand First. Poland has the Law and Justice Party, and Cookies 15, which are two different parties. So the United States of America doesn't have a right-wing populist party, but it's usually thought of as being one section, a faction of the Republican Party, which is associated with Donald Trump, who's obviously the party leader at the moment. He's their presidential candidate. In the United Kingdom, we have the UK Independence Party. Cool. Green parties, they tend to like radical left-wing politics, so lots of economic redistribution. Often they think that businesses should all be owned by their workers, not by owners. And they support, obviously, environmentalism because they're green parties. That's what they were set up for. They tend to dislike big business. They're supported, like the populists, not by organisations, but generally by sort of what's called leftist civil society. So this will be sort of small community cooperatives, so organisations of citizens in their region, or like shops and so on that are set up to support green ideas, so vegan shops or environmental shops. And sometimes they're also supported by environmental businesses, bigger ones, so like wind turbine manufacturers. They tend to be a minor party. They're coloured green, and they're relatively new parties. They're usually developed in the 1980s. And here we have a very unimaginative set of names. They're almost all called the Green Party. So Finland has the Green League. Germany has Die Grüne, which literally translates as the Greens. Israel has the Green Movement. Now they merged with the Labour Party to form the Zionist Union. So they're part of the Zionist Union. New Zealand has the Green Party. Britain, United Kingdom has the Green Party. United States of America, there is a Green Party. They run for president, but it's mainly associated with being a segment, a sub-organisation within the Democratic Party, which is associated with Al Gore. Centrists. They tend to be between Social Democrats and business liberals. Although there's two different types of centrists. There's agrarians and liberals. You tend to get agrarians only really in the Baltic Nordic region, and liberals tend to be elsewhere. And sometimes you have both liberals and agrarians even in the Baltic Nordic region. They tend to dislike radicalism. They're often kind of dying as parties, and Finland's a big exception to this, but they tend to be dying as parties because they don't really have a support base, and they're usually a minor party, but obviously Finland's a bit of an exception here because they're actually the largest party. Historically, they're very old parties. They're often called Liberal Party or the Centre Party or Agrarian Party. In Finland, you've got the Centre Party, which is agrarian-based, obviously the biggest party in Finland, which is quite unusual. Germany has the Free Democratic Party, a Liberal Party. New Zealand has ACT, which is a very minor Liberal Party. Spain has Ciudadanos, which just means citizens. Poland has two, both the Liberal Party, the Modern Party, and the Polish People's Party, which is an agrarian party. Centrists are segments of both Democrats and Republicans in the United States. And in Britain, we've got the Liberal Democrats, which are a Liberal Party. Radical left-wing parties. They tend to like socialism and workers' revolution. They don't like capitalism and the bourgeoisie. And recently, they've started to identify as anti-austerity parties, which means they're against cuts to public services. And they tend to be supported, much like right-wing populists, by populist movements, by organisations within communities. Very varied size. They tend to be dark red. They're often, not always, but they're often old communist parties which used to be supported by the Soviet Union. So Finland has the Left Alliance, Germany has Die Linke, New Zealand doesn't actually have a far-left party, but they are a faction of the Labour Party. Spain has, and this is probably one of the most moderate of the left-wing radical parties, Podemos, which literally in Spanish means we can. The United Kingdom is a bit odd because we've got the Socialist Workers' Party, but also Often, like in New Zealand, the radical left-wingers are a faction of the Labour Party, which is identified with a politician called Jeremy Corbyn, who somewhat unexpectedly won leadership of the Labour Party in the United Kingdom. So there's some interesting things going on there. Okay, cool. The last one, I promise this is the last one. Region lists, they really varied. The thing they like is their particular region, and sometimes if it's a poorer region, they'll support socialism, and if it's a richer region, they'll support capitalism, and sometimes they want their region to be independent. They're so varied you can't really categorise them in any other way. So Finland, you've got a minority interest party, which is the Swedish People's Party. They're obviously not in favour of the Åland region becoming independent. Israel has the Arab-Israeli Joint List Party. New Zealand has a Maori party. Maoris are the New Zealander natives who were there before it was colonised by Britain. Spain has loads of them. I've not even listed most of them here. The Republican Left of Catalonia, who want Catalonia to be an independent country. The Basque Nationalist Party, who also want it to be an independent country. Poland has a German Minority Electoral Committee, which just represents German speakers in Poland, much like the Swedish People's Party represents Swedish speakers in Finland. And the United Kingdom has, I've not listed all of them here for the United Kingdom, the Scottish National Party, which wants to be independent, Plaid, which is Welsh and doesn't want to be independent. Wales is a country just off England, part of the United Kingdom, and Sinn Féin, which is Irish and is in favour of independence. There's more, I've not listed every single one of them here. Okay, so why are the parties all so similar in all of these countries? The reason for that is they formed in response to divisions in the country, and those divisions tend to be quite similar in different countries. So church versus state, Christian Democrats versus liberals formed in that way, workers versus owners, social democrats and left-wing radicals versus business liberals, centre versus periphery, regionalists versus other parties. You have the Industrial Revolution, where agrarians and later Green parties formed who have different opinions about the Industrial Revolution. And the Post-Industrial Revolution, which is how Green and right-wing populist parties became more important. So if a country's politics doesn't seem to fit within this system, it's probably because there's something else, some other divisive event which isn't mirrored in other countries. So Israel, you've got the conflict with Palestine, which tends to form hawkish, so more sort of in favour of military intervention politicians, and dovish politicians who are against military intervention. That's where you get Likud versus Labour come from. And that's why it's a bit more difficult to characterise the Israeli political system in line with the other countries. In Ireland, you've got this unusual thing with the 1922 peace treaty with Britain, which formed Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. But those are the minority. Generally, most countries fit into that system. So what do you do if you don't know anything about a country's politics and it comes up in a debate? They all follow probably the basic structure of democratic policy. So it's like this: people elect parliament, parliament elects the government, which appoints the Supreme Court or government enforcement agencies, and then you'll have laws which are written by the government, parliament passes them, president signs them, Supreme Court checks their constitutional, and enforcement agencies enforce them. Maybe it's bicameral if it's a big country, or maybe it's presidential if it's the Americas, but it's probably not, so you don't need to worry about those differences. They probably have a social democratic and a business liberal as their main two parties, so a party similar to the National Coalition Party, the Social Democratic Party, and that will be most of their parliament. There's probably a small centrist party, which is likely to be agrarian in the Nordic-Baltic region or liberal elsewhere, and they'll sit in the middle. If there's a region that has a different identity, there's probably a party to represent that. So that could be some of the centrists. There's probably a Green party and a radical left-wing party. So it could just be a Green party, it could be radical left-wing, or there could be one of each, or there could be multiple ones of each. And there's probably a right-wing populist party on the right. And without knowing anything about the country you're talking about, I can say this is probably how their parliament looks. I don't know for sure. But if you picked a random European or American or Middle Eastern or Far Eastern country, probably their political system can be characterised in this way. And from there, you don't need to know anything. You can just bluff it. You can talk about what you know from the Finnish political system and apply that knowledge. Cool. So I'm going to move on now to talk about some concepts of formal political institutions. So the first one I'm going to deal with is representation, which is a really big concept. And there are, I think, 4 types of representation. So the first one is, here's an example. If someone's called your representative, they were appointed to represent you, then that's one type of representation. That's called formalistic representation. Don't worry too much about the titles, just remember there's a type of representation which is about whether or not someone was appointed to be your representative. The second type is if they're like you, they share your demographic characteristics, so it could be gender, could be age, could be race, and that's called reflexive representation. So my representative is like me because she's my age and she represents people of my age group, or she's the same racial group as me, or, I mean, she wouldn't be the same gender as me, but he could be the same gender as me. And that means that your representatives are like you. The third type is speaking up for your interests. So that's called substantive representation, people who agree with your interests and share your values. And the fourth is a feeling like someone represents you, symbolic representation. It could be a figure of national significance, just something that stands for me. And what's important to remember is those aren't all the same thing. They're all different types of representation. A famous example, a male feminist could, and we can have an argument about this, but I'm just using this as an example, a male feminist could do a better job of substantively representing women than a female misogynist would, but the female is better reflexive representation. So in terms of looking like women, in terms of having the same demographic characteristics as women, a female misogynist is a good representative there. But if you think feminism, as I do, stands up for the interests of women, then that's bad substantive representation. Equally, someone could be a good, like, standing up for someone's interests. So a party leader that I agree with could be a good person to stand up for my interests, but if they're not my representative, they're not a formalistic representative. And the reason it's important is because if you're careful about how you use the word representative, you can trick people into accepting things that they wouldn't accept. So if you're in a debate about quotas for women in Parliament, saying it's good representation of women might be useful if you're in opening government. And what you've done there, you've deliberately confused reflexive representation, having people who are women in Parliament, who look like women, who have the same characteristics, but you haven't necessarily proven, you can try to prove it, you haven't necessarily proven that they speak up for women's interests, right? Equally, if someone's doing that to you, be careful, notice, and say, I don't think those are the same type of representation. So if there's a debate about representation, think, are they like the people that they're representing? Are they the same demographically? Are they just being designated representatives? Are they actually agreeing with the values and interests of them? Or are they just standing for in a sort of symbolic, feeling-y way? Okay, the next concept I want to talk about, accountability. So accountability is the ability to hold people to account for their actions. It means there's a punishment if they do something wrong. It could be being humiliated, or it could be being removed as a politician. How do we get representation? So some people argue it's about accountability, and some people argue it's about picking the right people. And it's probably a bit of both in reality, but think about what's in your interest to claim about how you get representation. So let's take the motion requiring 50% of MPs to be randomly selected citizens. So you'd elect half of the MPs to the Eduskunta, and the other half would just be random people picked from the Finnish population. So if you're opening government on that, you probably think it's about appointing the right people, that the citizens who you appoint are going to agree with the citizens within the country, and that's the most important thing. But if you're opening opposition, you probably think it's about whether or not you can fire them, because obviously these randomly selected citizens aren't going to care whether or not you agree or disagree with what they've done. So opening opposition probably want to say what's important for representation is accountability, the fact that you can punish people for their decisions. Okay, I'm actually running a bit short on time, so I'll skip through this one and this one. Okay, cool. Let's talk about thresholds. By the way, all of this is going to be uploaded online, so the things I've skipped through you can look up separately. So some countries say you can't have MPs represent your party unless your party gets a certain amount of the vote. That's called a threshold. In systems like Britain, it's because it's quite difficult to win seats at all. In proportional systems, it's like 2 to 10%. So I think Finland has a threshold of 10%. Maybe someone can post on the Facebook thread if I'm wrong about that. But some of the countries, it's higher. Germany has a 5% threshold, which stops fascist or communist parties from winning. And Turkey has a 10% threshold, which tries to stop Kurdish parties from winning. Didn't work in the last election. So maybe Finland doesn't have a threshold. Someone post on the Facebook thread whether or not Finland has a threshold for MPs. The argument in favour is that it keeps out radical parties and it stops really small parties from winning, which make it harder to form a government because it's difficult to negotiate with them. And the arguments against, it wouldn't have stopped the Finns party from winning seats and getting into government. And the small parties are important because, like, for instance, how else could you represent the Swedish minority? And maybe the parties aren't radical and it doesn't matter too much to get elected, like the Green Party. Okay, let's talk about quotas. So quotas either are a requirement to nominate a certain percentage of MPs with a characteristic or to elect a certain percentage of MPs. So it's usually gender, but it could be race, sexual orientation or trans status. Sometimes they're party quotas, parties impose them on themselves. Sometimes they're legislated quotas, which means that parties have to comply or they aren't allowed to run for election or have to pay a big fine. So these are the arguments for adopting quotas of women. Would it increase women's reflexive representation because more women are represented, and increase women's substantive representation because the female MPs can advocate for women's issues? Or will it be that parties will pick women who agree with the status quo and won't challenge sexist things, sexist laws in Parliament, which is not good for substantive representation? Will they not be taken seriously, their ideas be taken seriously because they're seen as sort of unworthy of the job they've been given, which is bad for substantive representation? And will they be resented and not promoted, which is bad for symbolic representation? That's how representation fits in with a political institution like quotas. Oh, participation and choice. So, your opportunities to take part in the political system are increasing over time, and that's your right to take part in the political system. So, to petition Parliament, that's a way of participating, or to write to government ministers, or to take government to court, or if they've broken the law, or you think they've implemented the law unfairly, or you can start a media campaign. It includes things like referendums and government consultations. And the thing with participation is it gives citizens more choice as to how they want to take part in politics. And so there's a big argument about whether or not participation and choice are a good thing. And this is often something that debates come down to. A debate will be a proposal to give citizens either more opportunity to participate or more choice in the way they participate. So the basic arguments on each side. If people can participate, they can express their preferences more clearly, which means politicians know what their citizens want, which means that politicians are able to respond to their citizens, and obviously politicians have an incentive through accountability to do what their citizens want, because otherwise they'll get fired, which means the country becomes more democratic with more participation and choice. And if you're against participation and choice, usually your argument will go something like this. The people who are going to take the opportunity to participate more will tend to be people who have more time to participate because they've got money to have lots of leisure time, which means richer citizens will tend to be the ones who will dominate, and that's unfair on poorer citizens. And the people who are more able to take the opportunity to participate, even if everyone had the same time, will be people who are more educated because they know more about politics and they understand politics better. Which means they can take advantage of the choice when other citizens can't. And that's also unequal and that's unfair on less educated citizens. So that means things are less democratic overall. Okay, and the other thing that you want to talk about in a debate about political choice is how citizens make decisions. And there are two ways of thinking about how citizens make decisions. There's what we call the traditional model and the sociological model. So in the traditional model, citizens think about what policies they prefer, how they tend to think about politics. So if they're a socialist, or if they're a conservative, or if they're a liberal, and then they'll look at a policy and try to work out how much that policy is like their policy preferences. And if they're a liberal and it's a very liberal policy, they'll like the policy, or if they're a socialist and it's a very conservative policy, they won't like the policy. And that's how citizens make decisions. And the other model is called the sociological model. And in this model, what happens is citizens trust political figures they think share their values. So socialists will tend to trust socialist political figures, conservatives will trust conservative political figures, and citizens don't have the time or knowledge to individually evaluate policies. So when they see a policy, they look at what the figures they trust think, and then they decide based on what the endorsements are whether or not they like the policy. Now, as before, it's probably a bit of both, right? In reality, people will tend to evaluate policies on their own terms, and sometimes they'll tend to see what the politicians think. But what you need to think about in a debate is, what is it in your interest to claim is the way that citizens make decisions? So, if you're giving citizens more choices in a debate, you want to say that citizens are going to very sensibly look at the policy preferences and evaluate whether or not it's like what they want to achieve, and decide in that way that citizens are very rational individuals. Or if you're giving citizens fewer choices, generally you want to say it's because citizens actually aren't making all that sensible decision, they're just deferring to what politicians that they've elected would have said anyway, which means it's a waste of time, or worse. So, this is quite small, oh dear. Okay, I hope this is visible to everyone. If not, come back to this later. But if you're OG on limiting presidents to 8 years in power, what you're doing is giving citizens there less choice, because they can't elect the president that they want to. So the reason for that is that citizens tend to see the president as embodying their nation, which means they trust them too much. They can't make their own decisions because they just trust the president, because they care about their country, and their president is symbolic of their country. And that means if the president is very corrupt, she's difficult to remove because citizens trust her excessively. Alternatively, if you're opening opposition, you're giving citizens more choice here, right? Because you're saying citizens after 8 years should still be able to choose the president who's in charge. So you're looking at the traditional model. So you're going to say citizens, if they don't like the president 4 years or 8 years into office, can vote them out, and corrupt president is going to get voted out. And so why would you want to stop citizens from being able to choose the president they want for no good reason? Because they're going to be very rational about assessing whether or not the president is good or bad. So that's the way that you can use the two different models based on what the motion is. I'm going to skip through trust and approval. Okay, let's talk about type of policy preference. So there's two types of policy preference: positional issues and valence issues. So a positional issue is where we can't agree on what we want to achieve because the country is divided on what the ideal outcome is. So should same-sex marriage be legal? Should immigration be higher or lower? Or should reducing inequality be more important than increasing economic growth? These are, I'm sure if I polled you in your rooms, some of you would think one outcome is better and some of you would think another outcome is better. You've got what's called a valence issue, which is where we all agree what we want, but we can't agree on how to get there. So if I polled the room, I imagine everyone in the room would say economic growth is a good thing, and we want more economic growth, or we should stop climate change, or we want less crime. And what people disagree on there is how to achieve those outcomes, and that's a valence issue. So positional issues, can't agree on the outcome. Valence issues, we all agree on the outcome, but we can't agree on how to achieve it. So why don't we just deal with valence issues if we all want the same thing? Well, the reason is that sometimes politicians are incompetent or corrupt or don't have enough knowledge on how to solve the problem. And in general, because politicians are experts, they'll tend to be more competent and they'll tend to be less self-interested because they've got to respond to the whole population. Politicians are thought to be better at solving valence issues than citizens because they're experts. And positional issues, it's generally thought that because politicians are kind of distant from the people and they don't agree with everything that the citizens want because they tend to be more rich or more highly educated or spend more time with business leaders, they'll tend to be less good at solving positional issues. And so most issues are some mixture of the two. So in the referendum we've got on the European Union, we've got a positional issue, which is whether or not we want to increase or decrease migration. Citizens who want to reduce migration will tend to support leaving the European Union, and citizens who want to increase migration will want to be part of the European Union. And so that's a positional issue. We can't agree on the outcome, and that's what's dividing people. And then we've got whether or not we want more or less economic growth. And I think more or less every British citizen wants more economic growth. The problem is we can't agree would being in the EU help economic growth or not. And so if you think that having a referendum on European membership is a really good thing, it's probably because you think the most important issue is the migration issue, because that's where out-of-touch politicians aren't responding to what citizens want. But if you don't want a referendum, it's probably because you think it's the valence issue, it's economic growth. Politicians think that staying in the European Union is sensible, and citizens aren't educated enough to tell the difference. If you're having a debate about that, you want to emphasise different types of issues as being the most important issues within the debate. And that's a framing issue. Political parties. I'll go through that. Yeah, I'll leave that. Okay. Quick run through. What do you do if you get a motion about formal political institutions? So, the first thing, what do you know about the country's politics? And if nothing, don't panic, because you probably know about Finnish politics, and Finnish politics are probably comparable. So the next thing to ask is, how will this policy affect the core concepts of democracy? So how will it affect the 4 types of representation? How will it affect choice and participation? How will it affect accountability? And how will it affect the outputs of the democratic system? Valence issues, will it make the country better or worse at working out how to solve problems where we all agree on what we want to achieve, we just can't agree on how to achieve it? Will it make us better at resolving positional issues? So will it make politicians more or less responsive to what citizens want? And trust, how will it affect how citizens feel about their political system? Okay. I've got one last section. Now, I realise I've been going on for an hour now, and I don't want to do questions. So I'll try and run through this reasonably quickly, and then we can do questions. If you've got any questions, though, start posting them on the Facebook thread so I can start thinking up answers as I'm talking through the last bit. So this was in response to a special request, so I've written this specially for this talk. So we've covered the traditional forms of political institutions, but some countries are experimenting with other ways of doing politics. So the first is the referendum, and there's two ways of doing referendums. Some of them are voluntary, sometimes they're mandatory. So if it's a voluntary referendum, the government says we want to hold a referendum on an issue, and they draft a referendum law and send it to Parliament, and Parliament debates and amends and passes the law. And remember, Parliament picked the government, so they probably wouldn't pick a government that wanted stupid referendums they don't agree with. The President signs the law, the Supreme Court confirms it's okay to have a referendum, and the electoral agency then administers the campaign amongst citizens. And citizens vote yes or no and send that response to the government. So, question, are voluntary referendums more democratic? People say yes, because it gives people a say on politics, but other people will say no, because government and Parliament would never agree to a referendum that goes against their interest. And it's sometimes a way governments avoid being held accountable on an issue. It would be more democratic for the government to make the decision and then vote them out if we don't agree with the decision. It would be more accountable rather than the government holding the referendum just to pass a law on the issue, and then we can vote them out at the next election if we don't like what they're doing. And sometimes referendums are mandatory, you have to have them. So the government says we want to have this policy, and the Supreme Court says, hang on a second, there's a law here. Yeah, and then they say the Constitution says you need to hold a referendum on this. And so as it happens before, the government passes a law on the referendum, Parliament passes it, and the electoral agency enforces the system. So most countries have mandated referendums on constitutional issues. So usually you can't make a big change to the constitution, that's the set of rules that determine how government works, without having a referendum on it. Except in the UK, United Kingdom, It's unusual for governments just to voluntarily hold a referendum. Okay, the next one is called citizens' initiative. And that works a bit differently. So in this, instead of government saying they want a policy, citizens say that they want a policy. And they organise a petition, which the electoral agency will count, and they confirm that the signatures are all valid on the petition and send it to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court confirms it's a constitutional initiative, that you're allowed to have this vote. And the electoral agency organises a campaign. And up until this point, you'll note that the government, the parliament, have had nothing to do with this process whatsoever. Now, do they really? Well, that's a bit complicated. So, firstly, they'll be campaigning the people, telling the people how they think they ought to vote on the citizens' initiative. And also, the electoral agency is part of the government, so are they really independent from the government and parliaments? But regardless, the people vote yes or no on the initiative, there'll be a referendum, and then that goes to the government to implement. So people say that citizens' initiative is more democratic because it gives people a say, even if the government disagrees. So unlike a referendum, citizens can just decide to have a citizens' initiative without having to ask the government. But the other argument is that rich, highly educated citizens tend to be the people who dominate the process, and that shuts out poorer citizens, and it's unfair. And the other thing to say is that big companies sometimes hijack the process. So if there's I think there's a case in America that a company organised a citizens' initiative to build a bridge that cost loads of money and wasn't very helpful. The next one is consultative democracy. So what happens is government says there's a problem we need to solve, and they ask the people for their opinions on how to solve the problem. And the people give their responses, and then, as it happened last time, the government then, based on the responses, drafts a law, Parliament passes the law, Supreme Court, and well, that should say Government Enforcement Agency, not electoral agency, I'm sorry there. So people say consultative democracy is more democratic because it gives citizens a voice, but some people argue governments just ignore the responses they don't like and throw them in the bin and only listen to the citizens who agree with them. So the other option is what's called deliberative democracy. And what happens here is it's the process of a discussion. That's what deliberation is, a considered discussion towards an outcome. So usually a BP judging discussion is a deliberation and not just an argument, although I've been in ones that weren't a deliberation. But that's a different problem. Normally, they're supposed to be deliberation. It's not just a conversation. Deliberation is about listening and coming to consensus. So the government will say, there's a problem we need to solve, and then they'll ask the people for opinions, and instead of just giving their opinions, there'll be a period of deliberation, which a deliberative assembly is set up and the people have conversations with each other and within this assembly, and it's all very, very much conversations. And then after the deliberation, citizens give responses to the government, and then government legislates as normal in the way it normally would. So is deliberative democracy more democratic? Well, people say yes, it gives people a say. And actually, very few people think deliberative democracy isn't more democratic. They just say it's not practical, that people aren't willing to sit and listen in that way. And actually, instead of being a deliberative democracy, it becomes a consultative democracy, which richer citizens tend to dominate. Okay, so that's the entire talk. As I say, I skipped through some sections. You can go back and read them. It's very easy to read in the presentation. I've got one question. If anyone else has a question, post them on the Facebook thread now. So, hang on, I'll come back and you can see my face. How do I do that? Okay. So the question is, what do we need to know about the upcoming UK referendum on European Union membership? So the first thing I'd say is, you probably don't need to know anything that wasn't in this talk. So the reason it was initiated was because we have a right-wing populist party called UKIP, which was threatening the Business Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, and that's true in lots of countries. So in Finland, I think the National Coalition Party was thought to lose votes to the True Finns Party, and most right-wing populist parties don't like the European Union. So the Conservative Party, the Business Liberals, thought they can have this referendum as a way of showing that, you know, they agree with UKIP on the European Union issue. So there's a big argument: was having the referendum a good idea or not? And people would say yes, it's a good idea because it gives citizens a voice, and other people say no, because what's happening is that a small number of organisations, particularly media organisations, are dominating the debate, and we're not having a good discussion about the European Union, and that actually citizens are voting on issues they don't understand because the economic situation is very complicated, and so aren't expressing their true preferences. And then, you know, the other argument would go that people do understand the economics naturally. This is just a citizens' revolt against migration, which has been forced on us from above. Do we have any other questions? Oh, actually, sorry, there's one other thing to say about the European Union referendum in Britain. It's currently very close, so it really could go either way. And so something that's quite a controversial issue is that when you have an opinion poll, when you ask people, ring them up and you ask them, how are you going to vote in the referendum? Lots of young people say they would vote to remain in the European Union, but also say that they, you know, aren't that interested in voting. They might stay at home. They're not really sure if they're going to go out and vote. And so if you account for all the young people who say that they would vote to remain, you've got a huge majority of people want to stay in the European Union. And only when you account for the fact that the people who are certain to vote are older people who tend to want to leave the European Union, do you get the fact it's so close. So there's an argument there that because there's this group of people who have demanded the right to have the referendum and you know, are more likely to turn out to vote, we've actually ended up with an outcome people wouldn't have voted for if it were a general election, because more young people would turn out to vote. So there's a big argument in Britain as to whether or not this was a democratic outcome, and I wouldn't be surprised, given the amount of controversy about that, if there's a motion about referendums at the European University Debating Championship. It could be about the European Union, should more countries have a referendum on the European Union, or it could just be about referendums in general. As I say, I think generally you can apply political concepts to that, like accountability and representation. So I wouldn't get too hung up on the specifics of either the country that you're in or referendums in general. Do we have any other questions? I've only got one here. Okay, two questions. One's about impact that Brexit would have for the European Union. There's another one about two-party political systems. I'm probably a really bad person to ask about the impact that Brexit would have on the European Union. I don't study the European Union particularly. Oh, I've got another question. Let me just add it to the list. Okay, cool. I think the main impact is it would make other countries' citizens think they're more likely to be able to leave. It would also remove a voice from the European Union. Britain is usually a voice in the European Union that is less in favour of more political integration. So I think that's probably the impact. I don't really know, sorry. I'm bad at answering that question. Okay. How would I prop? This House supports two-party political systems over multi-party political systems. So this is like a really classic debate, two-party political systems versus multi-party political systems in my area of political science. The first thing I'd say is this is mainly a debate about representation. So how do we best get representation within a political system? And I think both sides will be wanting to talk about how people feel about the representation that they're getting. So the argument for a two-party political system is that it's really, if you've got a two-party system, one of those two parties will be in government and the other one will be in opposition. And so it's really easy to tell for any citizen who is to blame for a government policy you don't agree with. So this is a question about choice. We're deliberately taking away people's choice. And as I said in the presentation, it's not necessarily a bad thing to take away choice from people, because that can make it easier for people who are less time to be involved in politics or less education about politics to take part in politics. So the argument there is you get better representation because everyone can take part on the same level. And that's why you want a two-party system. Less choice means everyone is more equal in how they make that decision. Do we keep the government or do we fire the government? Because you know which party is to blame. It's the party that's in government. And then a multi-party political system, you're arguing in favour of more choice there. You think that people should have more parties to choose from within that political system. So there, you'll be arguing that the multi-party political system lets citizens say if you're a left-wing voter in a multi-party political system, you have three parties to choose from. You've got the Social Democratic Party, which will be more in the centre. You've got the Green Party, which will be more that way, in the left wing, and a radical left-wing party even to the left of them. And you can choose which of those three you agree with, whereas in a two-party political system, you've just got one party. Other ways that you might talk about representation is reflexive representation. So when you've got big parties, it's easier to represent very small minorities. So if you've got 100 MPs divided by 6 parties, it might be difficult to make sure you get a good representation of all the ethnic minorities and all of the regional minorities within the country. So in a two-party system, because the parties are bigger, it's easier to make sure all of the citizens can get represented in all of the parties, whereas in a smaller parties, it's harder for every type of citizen to get represented. Okay. The next question, I don't want to keep you too long, so I'll take one more question after this. This is actually a motion I set, which is the Manchester IV, which is this House believes parliamentary electoral system should include a constituency link. And a constituency link is the idea that you've got a small number of MPs per region. So I think in Finland there are about 10 MPs or so per parliamentary region. Some countries it's different. So in the United Kingdom we've got 1 MP per region. In Britain we've got 1 MP per region, and in Ireland there are usually 3 MPs per region. And so it's quite often true in Britain and Ireland that people care a lot about their local representative. They know who their MP is. They'll go and talk to their MP if they want to communicate with Parliament. Whereas in systems that don't have a constituency representative, people tend to talk to political parties rather than local representatives for representation. So this is partly, so if you've got a constituency link, you'll have both local MPs and parties you can talk to. So it's a debate about choice. So if you are a citizen and you want to engage with Parliament, if you've got a local representative, you can you can choose which representative you want to talk to. So you can choose your local representative or you can choose your party representative, and that means that people have more opportunities to participate. And that, that could be a bad thing if you're on op, or that could be a good thing if you're on prop. The other thing to say is that citizens often find it easier to engage with a local representative because it's an individual, it's a person you can talk to, it's a real person, it's not this faceless organisation that you can't deal with. So maybe people have more trust in their political system if they can engage directly with an individual rather than having to talk to a political party that doesn't necessarily have a personality and they can't identify with. I think that's probably most of what I'd say in open government. You can do some fun things in closing government, but yeah, I mean that's a debate about representation. Who should represent you? Should you have an individual to talk to a real life person, or does that end up wasting resources on opposition? Cool. One last question. So 2 questions about restricting people from running for office. So the Ljubljana IV 2015, in new democracies, military leaders should not be allowed to run for office. And the SSE Riga Debate Academy 2015, this house would ban convicted criminals from holding elected office. Again, this is a debate about choice. So proposition saying people should have less choice, and opposition saying people should have more choice. So on opposition, you want to argue that citizens will make a sensible decision about whether or not they want to elect a military leader or a convicted criminal. So there are actually really good reasons why you might want a military leader to run for office. A military leader is someone who is good at running an organisation, they know how to organise people, and they're probably reasonably charismatic, and they know how the government runs. Equally, convicted criminals can be really good advocates for criminals' rights. So, you know, sometimes criminals are dreadful people, they were born in terrible circumstances, and they can advocate for criminals' rights. And so people should have the choice as to whether or not they want to elect that person. And on proposition, what you want to argue is that letting people make that decision, they won't make that decision sensibly, they'll make the decision badly, so you need to take away the choice. So in a new democracy, you might argue a military leader is likely to organise a military takeover of the country, and that citizens won't be able to decide whether or not the military leader is trustworthy. And in terms of convicted criminals, that one's a bit more subtle, but you argue that having convicted criminals means a country is more corrupt, but also even if they're not corrupt, if you've got really good anti-corruption mechanisms, that they'll be less trustworthy, that citizens will look at all of these criminals in government and say, that's a really bad government. Now, opposition might respond, why have they chosen to elect them? And you know, you need to have an answer. Why would people elect someone that they don't trust to run their government? But yeah, I think those are debates about choice, and you need to argue either citizens are going to be very sensible in terms of assessing who they want to be in their government, or you need to argue that actually citizens aren't always that sensible and tend to have an excessive level of trust for people who are in charge. So, for instance, the reason that you might elect a convicted criminal that you don't trust into office is because a party nominates them to be one of their members of parliament, and no one notices, right? The citizens don't pay enough attention because they just trust the political party blindly, and they don't know what they're talking about. Yeah, I think that's everything. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for having me, FINDA. It's been nice to have people listen to me for an hour and 20 minutes. I hope this has been informative for you too. I'm going to make sure that you guys get the PowerPoint presentation. As I said at the time, I missed some of the sections out, so you can read through those. There's also some facts on there. The only other thing I'd say is I think sometimes it can be a bit intimidating if you're having one of these debates about, you know, parliamentary electoral systems or military leaders or criminals in elected office, and everyone in the debate is talking about one political context. So it could be Germany, or it could be Ireland, or it could be, sadly, the United Kingdom in the European Universities Debate Championship. And I think you need to not be intimidated by that, and you need to, you know, even if you don't know about the country that they're talking about, know that that country is probably similar to other countries that you do know about, and be willing to challenge them by assuming that their country is most important. So that's probably the biggest hang-up I think that I see people have, is thinking they don't have knowledge about countries, when actually you've got loads of knowledge about countries. You just need to realise that you've got it and be willing to apply it. So, yeah, that's all. Have a nice evening. I hope this was useful to you. Bye.